The customs officer stopped them on the road outside Marseille in the early hours of the morning. The handcart carried 2 large parcels, bound tight with cord. Léon said it was travellers' luggage. The officer let them pass. By the following afternoon, a dismembered body had been found in a ditch, covered with stones and sand, at the edge of a country road. What had happened inside the shops on the Rue de la République? Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now let's begin. It was the 19th of March, 1877, in the port city of Marseille, France, to the second largest city in the country, and a place accustomed to the business of arrivals and departures. The Mediterranean wind came sharp off the sea that morning, carrying with it the smell of brine and coal smoke from the vessels moored along the Vieux Port. On the Rue de la République, a wide commercial thoroughfare laid out during the great urban renovations of the preceding decades, 2 adjoining shop fronts sat quiet behind their shuttered windows. One sold cheese, the other sold hats and millinery. Behind them, connected by a narrow interior room, were a drawing room and a kitchen. Beneath the kitchen, reached by a trapdoor set flush with the tiled floor, lay a stone cellar. The shops had been purchased the previous October by a widow named Madame Boye, who had come to Marseille from the inland city of Montpellier in search of a new beginning. She was accompanied by her daughter, Marie, 18 years of age, and by a young man of 23 who had been introduced to their neighbours as her nephew. His name was Léon Vitale. He was not her nephew. What was discovered on the road outside the city that March would expose a history of deception, dependency and destruction that reached back across 2 years and 200 miles. To understand what occurred on that morning in March, it is necessary to return to the city of Montpellier and to a family whose domestic circumstances had long been approaching a kind of crisis. Madame Boye had been born Mademoiselle Maricela, a domestic servant who in 1859 married her employer, a merchant named Monsieur Boye. He was a man of modest but sufficient fortune, neither part of the social elite nor lacking in comfort. He employed her, he came to love her, he married her. That same year she bore him a daughter, whom they named Marie. For some years life continued agreeably. Monsieur Boye, however, suffered from deteriorating health, and in time was confined almost entirely to his bed, afflicted with rheumatic gout that left him weakened and largely dependent upon his wife's attention. It was during this period of his decline that Madame Boye began a relationship with a young bookseller's assistant named Léon Vitale. He was 21 years of age. She was 40. She introduced him to her husband as a relative who would help manage their financial affairs. Monsieur Boye, weakened and trusting, raised no objection. In May of 1874, the doctors informed Monsieur Boye that he had not long to live. He wished to see his daughter, who had by then spent several years in a convent school in the city of Marseille. A friend was sent to fetch her. The Mother Superior received him politely and told him that young Marie had grown greatly attached to the religious life and had expressed her desire to take her vows. When word of her father's dying condition was conveyed to Marie, she said that if she could save his life she would come, but as that was not possible, she would remain and pray for him. Before the friend had returned to Montpellier, Monsieur Boye was dead. He was 46 years of age. In his will he had left the greater part of his estate, some 100,000 francs, to his daughter Marie, ending with her mother appointed as legal guardian and entitled to draw from the income of the capital until Marie should come of age. It was a clause that would come to govern the lives of everyone it touched. Madame Boye had never taken her daughter's religious devotion very seriously. Now, with the fortune hanging upon it, she took it seriously indeed. Within months of her husband's death, she withdrew Marie from the convent. Marie celebrated her 16th birthday in 1875. She had grown by all accounts into an attractive young woman, self-possessed, composed, and possessed of the olive complexion and dark eyes common to the region of her birth. Despite her earlier reluctance to leave the convent, she appeared to settle into her new life with a certain ease. She visited the shops. She attended the theatre, and young men of polite standing were known to lift their hats as she passed, and she would acknowledge them with a smile. Nothing in her bearing suggested anything further than the ordinary pleasures of a young woman returned to society. Léon Vitale, however, had noticed her. Following her husband's death, Madame Boye had yielded herself entirely to Léon's influence. She had given him money to establish himself as an independent second-hand bookseller. The trade brought with it a certain reputation, as many such dealers in the city were known to combine their profession with money-lending and the sale of improper material. Léon was attentive, persuasive, and accustomed to the exercise of influence over women older than himself. But Marie was young, she was attractive, and in a few years the whole of her father's fortune would pass to her. He paid her particular attention. This did not go unobserved by Madame Boye, who responded by sending Marie to a convent school in Lyon to complete her education. She was unaware that her daughter had already arranged to correspond with Léon in her absence. Marie, in turn, was unaware that her mother continued to conduct her relationship with him. In January of 1876, a theft occurred in the household. Madame Boye was in the habit of concealing money and bonds throughout the house, within the pages of books, folded into dresses, hidden behind a portrait of her late husband. Behind that portrait, bonds to the value of approximately 11,000 francs had been secreted. They were now gone. The police were called. 3 days later, Madame Boye withdrew the complaint. No explanation was recorded. Nothing more was said of the matter. Only Léon and Marie could have known where the bonds were concealed. Madame Boye drew her own conclusions, though she did not act upon them. Later that year, Léon announced that he was departing for Paris. He continued to write to Marie. She continued to write to him. By the autumn of 1876, Madame Boye had resolved to make a change. She would leave Montpellier. She would go to Marseille. She would find her daughter a suitable husband. They arrived in Marseille on the 6th of October, 1876. Madame Boye purchased the 2 adjoining shops on the Rue de la République at a price considerably above their true value. She attended to the cheese shop herself. Marie presided over the millinery. The arrangement appeared from the outside entirely respectable. In January of 1877, Léon Vitale arrived in the city. It had been decided, so as not to provoke gossip, that he should present himself to their neighbours as Madame Boye's nephew and as Marie's cousin. As the weeks passed, Madame grew increasingly unsettled. She had come to perceive that something concealed was passing between her lover and her daughter. She even wondered in her more agitated moments whether they might be attempting to harm her. She resolved that when she had recovered her composure, she would go to Mass, recover her power of attorney, and send Léon away for good. She did not accomplish this in time. On the morning of Monday, the 19th of March, 1877, Madame Boye rose early to attend Mass. Before she left the house, she reminded Léon that this was to be his last day in her service, and that upon her return she expected to find him gone. It was just after 7 o'clock when she departed. She returned at 1 in the afternoon. Léon was still there. Words were exchanged. Madame Boye withdrew to the sitting-room to rest. Léon followed her. There was a struggle. She called out for her daughter. Marie did not come to her assistance. Instead, she banged the doors of the adjacent room and opened and shut drawers, drowning out the sound. By evening, the shop boy had been sent home. The neighbours had seen and heard nothing of consequence. Madame Boye had not been seen since her return from Mass. It was the shop boy who first raised the alarm. He had, the previous evening, then waited near the shops after his dismissal, and observed Léon and Marie leave the premises together, pushing a handcart upon which sat 2 large parcels, bound with cord. He followed them for a short distance before they passed beyond the city boundary, and he turned back. He said nothing that night. The following morning, he spoke to an inquisitive neighbour who had observed the same scene through the keyhole of the adjoining door. Together they went to the police. At the same time that the shop boy and his neighbour were presenting themselves at the prefecture, the police had already received a separate report. A dismembered body had been discovered in a ditch on the road outside Marseille, partially concealed beneath stones and loose sand. An officer escorted the shop boy to the city morgue. He identified the dress found with the remains as belonging to his mistress, Madame Boye. The police proceeded immediately to the Rue de la République. They found the premises in a condition that suggested recent and thorough cleaning. The floor of the sitting-room had been washed. The cellar, reached by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, showed signs of disturbance. It was a stone-floored space, not soil, as had apparently been hoped, and bore evidence of a failed attempt at burial. Items were set aside and catalogued. Personal effects belonging to Madame Boye, correspondence, documents pertaining to the power of attorney that Léon Vitale had persuaded her to sign, and the remaining money and bonds that Marie had been observed counting through the keyhole on the morning following the crime. The medical examination of the remains confirmed death by violence. The disfigurement of the face, it was determined, had been carried out deliberately, with the intention of preventing identification. A sharp instrument had been employed. The presence of bruising about the throat indicated that strangulation had been attempted before the final blow was struck. The cause of death was recorded as stabbing. The examination was methodical, and the conclusions it reached were unambiguous. The degree of mutilation, the investigators noted, had required both deliberation and time. It had not been the act of a moment. Reports were sealed and forwarded to the examining magistrate. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now let's continue. Léon Vitale and Marie Boye were arrested at the premises on the Rue de la République. Both denied all knowledge of the crime. Marie stated that her mother had gone to Montpellier. Léon repeated the same account. Within a short time, however, the evidence presented to them proved irrefutable. They confessed. Both were formally charged with the willful murder of Madame Boye. They were remanded to custody. The date of the trial was set for the summer assizes. The trial opened on the 2nd of July 1877, not in Marseille, where the crime had occurred, but in the nearby city of Aix-en-Provence, i.e. before the Cour d'assises of the Bouches-du-Rhône. The courtroom filled early on the first day. The public benches were occupied before the doors had been open an hour. The press had followed the case with considerable attention since the arrest. Their accounts were marked by a particular preoccupation with appearance. Léon Vitale was described in the newspapers as insignificant in bearing, thin and pale, a man whose manner inspired neither sympathy nor dread. The descriptions of Marie were of a different character. She was written of as a young woman of striking appearance, olive-skinned, small and elegant in her movements, though with, as more than one correspondent observed, a cold expression that did not vary throughout the proceedings. The prosecution presented the evidence in orderly sequence. The testimony of the shop boy, one who described the handcart and the parcels and the road leading out of the city by night. The testimony of the neighbour who had observed Marie counting money through the keyhole on the morning of the 20th. The medical findings of the examining physician. The correspondence recovered from the premises that established the nature of the relationship between Léon and Marie, and the confession itself, which had been taken down in writing and signed by both. For the defence it was argued that Marie had been entirely under the influence of Léon Vitale, a man older, more experienced, and possessed of a capacity for manipulation that a young woman of 18 could not reasonably have been expected to resist. It was further noted that the blow which caused death had been struck by Léon, and that Marie's participation, though grave, had been shaped by circumstances not wholly of her own making. The presiding judge ordered Léon removed from the courtroom when Marie took the stand, observing that her answers appeared to be given with an eye upon him rather than upon the court. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Léon Vitale was found guilty of willful murder and sentenced to death. Marie Boye was found guilty with extenuating circumstances and sentenced to penal servitude for life. She showed no visible expression when the sentence was delivered. Léon was removed from the dock. The courtroom was cleared. The newspapers across France had made much of the trial. The love triangle, the inheritance, the convent-educated daughter, or the bookseller's assistant with his power of attorney and his cold calculations, it was the kind of case that a certain class of reader found both instructive and appalling in equal measure. The Petit Marseillais ran several columns on the verdict. Le Figaro commented upon it briefly and with evident distaste. The provincial press was more expansive, and in Montpellier, where Monsieur Boye had lived and died in reasonable comfort and in ignorance of everything that surrounded him, the reports were received with the particular sensation that local disgrace brings to a community that had once known the family in ordinary life. on the 17th of August, 1877, Léon Vitale was executed by guillotine. The procedure was carried out in the customary manner at the appointed hour before a gathered crowd, and the morning was warm, as mornings in Provence tend to be in August. The formalities were observed, the apparatus was prepared, the sentence was carried out. Death was immediate. His name passed from the public record with a speed that suggested relief rather than regret. Marie Boye was conveyed to a penal establishment to serve her sentence. She was, by all accounts, a model prisoner. She did not cause difficulty. She adhered to regulations. She was observed to apply herself diligently to whatever work was assigned to her. Whether this was an expression of genuine remorse or simply of the same cold efficiency that had characterized her conduct in the sitting room on the Rue de la République in March of 1877 was not recorded. In 1892, 15 years after the crime, she was released. She would have been 33 years of age. What became of her after that date is not known. The record closes. What remained, as it so often does, was the question of the ordinary. The shops on the Rue de la République were sold. The new proprietors had no connection to the Boye family. The trapdoor in the kitchen floor was no different from any other trapdoor in any other kitchen in Marseille. The cellar beneath it was stone, as it had always been. The sitting room, freshly whitewashed, received its new tenants without ceremony. In Montpellier, behind a portrait that no longer hung in any house, there had once been hidden 11,000 francs. They were never recovered. The file was sealed and archived in the prefecture at Aix-en-Provence, where it remained among thousands of others, bound in the ordinary way, with string, in a room that smelled of dust and old paper and the accumulated weight of other people's worst decisions. Outside, the Provençal sun continued its passage. The Mediterranean continued to receive whatever the city's rivers carried to it. The seasons continued to turn, indifferent to what had been done in their keeping.